ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, need to see identification and proof of legal status.
I'm senior immigration counsel at the Pentagon. Here's my security clearance.
Everyone says there's something. Got documentation proving citizenship right now?
Officers, you're violating...
The Pentagon City Metro Plaza was alive with the hum of evening commuters when it happened. Tuesday evening, 6:17 p.m. The kind of February cold that bit through business suits and turned breath into small clouds under streetlights. Kimberly Morgan had just emerged from the escalator after a grueling 14-hour workday reviewing classified immigration detention protocols. Still in her navy-tailored suit, leather briefcase in hand, Pentagon security badge clipped to her lapel. Her phone was buzzing with emails from the Justice Department, her mind already on the asylum policy brief due by midnight. Just another exhausting Tuesday in a career spent drafting the laws that governed millions of lives. Except two ICE agents were stepping out of an unmarked Ford Explorer she hadn't noticed idling near the taxi stand. Their body cameras were already rolling, red lights blinking in the dusk, recording what would become the most expensive immigration stop in federal law enforcement history. If you hate seeing people judged before being heard, please like and share this video. Hit that subscription button right now so you don't miss the next interesting story. Drop a comment where in the world you are watching from. Kimberly Morgan learned what immigration law could do to a family on a humid August afternoon in 1990, 3 weeks before 7th grade started. She was 12, sitting at her uncle's kitchen table in West Philadelphia, watching him pack a single suitcase while her mother wept in the doorway. INS agents had come that morning. Wrong address, wrong Marcus Morgan, wrong everything. But the system didn't pause for corrections. It swallowed people whole and asked questions later, if ever. Her uncle was detained for 6 days before an overworked public defender proved the obvious. He was a naturalized citizen with a social security card and a job at the post office. The case file had confused him with someone else. Simple mistake, devastating consequences. The law doesn't see us clearly, her mother had said that night, her Jamaican accent thickening with emotion. So you learn it better than anyone else can. Kimberly did exactly that. Georgetown Law, top of her immigration law seminar, JAG Core scholarship, declined in favor of DOJ's Office of Immigration Litigation. While her classmates chased corporate partnerships, she buried herself in deportation case law and asylum precedents. She wanted to build something her uncle never had, protection before the knock came. By 38, she'd become the invisible architect of federal immigration policy. The Immigration Enforcement Standards and Accountability Framework of 2020 carried 3 congressional sponsors' names in the headlines, but page 62 quietly credited K. Morgan, principal drafter, in 8-point font. 3 administrations called her for emergency consultations. Her scholarship was cited in federal court opinions. Justice Department attorneys forwarded her memos like scripture, but at airport security, store clerks still followed her. At conferences, people assumed she was the caterer. And now, standing in Pentagon City Metro Plaza, with her credentials dismissed by agents enforcing laws she'd written, Kimberly Morgan understood something profound. Expertise meant nothing when they'd already decided who you were. The facial recognition camera caught Kimberly Morgan at exactly 6:17 p.m. Frame 4, doctrine.jpg in the system log. She didn't know it was watching as she rode the escalator up from Pentagon City Metro, briefcase heavy with classified files, her shoulders aching from 14 hours hunched over asylum processing protocols that would never see sunlight. Somewhere in a server farm in Virginia, an algorithm made a decision in 0.03 seconds. Facial geometry, 94.7% match. Skin tone analysis, flagged. Commute pattern, departure time, consistent with service industry shifts. Database cross-reference, possible overstay violation. Case file number 2847, UV2019. Risk assessment. Detain for verification. The system had no context. It couldn't know that the woman in the navy suit had spent her morning rewriting detention standards for unaccompanied minors, or that her service industry shift pattern was actually a senior counsel working late at the Pentagon. It saw data points, probabilities, patterns, and it saw what it was trained to see. What made it worse, what made it unbearable in retrospect, was that Kimberly had warned them. November 2021, a 17-page legal memo to DHS leadership titled "Constitutional Vulnerabilities in Algorithmic Immigration Enforcement." She'd laid it out with surgical precision. Facial recognition systems trained on biased datasets would produce discriminatory outcomes. Probability thresholds below 98% would generate false positives at rates that violated due process. And algorithmic flags, without human oversight, would replicate historical patterns of racial profiling with technological veneer. Her memo had been filed under "reviewed but not implemented due to resource constraints." Now that same system had just flagged her, the woman who'd written the warning, as she walked across Pentagon City Plaza toward her car, thinking about the brief due at midnight and whether she had milk at home. 2 ICE agents received the alert on their mobile devices. They looked up, saw her crossing the plaza, and moved to intercept. The algorithm had done its job perfectly. They came from opposite sides, a practiced formation that cut off her path to the parking garage. Kimberly noticed their movement before she registered the vests, the way her body tensed instinctively despite her credentials, her clearance, her entire career spent inside the machinery of federal law. "Ma'am, we need to ask you some questions about your immigration status." Agent Cardi's voice carried across the plaza, professional and detached. Around them, commuters slowed, phones emerging from pockets. Someone would be recording. Everyone always was. Kimberly stopped, her mind already categorizing the encounter. No warrant visible, no probable cause articulated, public location, timestamp 6:19 p.m. The lawyer in her was already building the case, even as the woman in her felt something ancient and familiar settle in her chest. "Of course," she said evenly, reaching for her Pentagon security badge. No sudden movements, hands visible, the calculations people of color made without thinking. "Here's my identification." She extended the badge, letting it catch the streetlight. The Pentagon seal gleamed. Her photo, her name, her security clearance level, top secret /SCI. Her title, Senior Immigration Counsel, Office of General Counsel. Cardi glanced at it for perhaps 2 seconds. His partner, Fernandez, hadn't looked at all. "This doesn't prove legal status or citizenship," Cardi said, his tone unchanged. "Do you have your papers?" The words landed like a slap. Papers. As if her Pentagon credentials, her federal security clearance, her 2 decades of government service meant nothing. As if she was still someone who needed to prove her right to stand on American soil. "My papers," Kimberly repeated slowly, tasting the bitterness of it. "Birth certificate, passport, naturalization documents," Fernandez added, stepping closer. "We can wait while you retrieve them, or we can continue this conversation at the field office." The plaza seemed to tilt. This wasn't a clerical mistake. This was exactly what she'd spent her career fighting, now happening to her, carried out by men who enforced laws she'd written. And they had no idea. The body cameras recorded everything in clinical high definition. Timestamp, GPS coordinates, audio levels peaking as voices rose. Evidence that would later be replayed in federal court, dissected frame by frame, turned into $8 million and systemic reform. But in the moment, it just felt like humiliation stretched across 12 endless minutes. "I'm requesting the specific legal basis for this stop," Kimberly said, her voice steady despite the tremor trying to break through. Lawyer's trick: when powerless, speak the language of power. Cardi consulted his tablet briefly. Reasonable suspicion based on algorithmic risk assessment under operational guidelines. The words hit her like ice water. She knew those words, had written variations of them across 14 pages of legal argument. Not as authorization, as warning, as example of unconstitutional overreach dressed in technological language. She'd submitted that memo to DHS in 2021 with a recommendation: never implement enforcement based solely on algorithmic flags without individualized suspicion. Her eyes narrowed. "What operational guidelines specifically?" "Ma'am, we're not required to disclose our investigative methods," Fernandez cut in. "We need documentation now, or we'll need to continue this at the field office." A small crowd had gathered at the plaza's edge, phones raised. "Good. Witnesses." And Kimberly shifted her briefcase, letting her hand brush her phone in her pocket. The recording app activated with 3 quick taps, a habit from depositions and witness interviews. "I'm senior legal counsel at the Pentagon," she said, clearly projecting for the phones and cameras. "I specialize in immigration law and enforcement protocols. The stop you're conducting right now violates multiple federal guidelines." Cardi's expression hardened. "Ma'am, cooperation makes this easier." "For whom?" The question escaped before she could stop it. Fernandez's hand moved to his radio. "Ma'am, I need you to produce documentation immediately or—" "Or what?" Kimberly interrupted, something shifting in her voice. "You'll detain me without probable cause? On a public street? Based on an algorithm?" The agents exchanged glances. They still didn't understand who they'd stopped. "I've already informed you," Kimberly said, her voice dropping into the controlled cadence she used for congressional testimony. "I'm senior immigration counsel at the Pentagon. I'm one of the nation's leading immigration law experts." Fernandez actually smirked. "Sure you are, ma'am. Just show us your documentation." Something crystallized in that moment. The dismissal. The condescension. The absolute certainty in his voice that she couldn't possibly be who she claimed. Kimberly felt the lawyer in her rise to the surface, cold and precise. Under 8 U.S.C. Section 1357 A.1, she began, her voice clear enough to carry across the plaza, "Immigration officers may interrogate any alien or person believed to be an alien as to his right to be in the United States." And subsection A.2 permits arrest without warrant for any alien who in his presence or view is entering or attempting to enter the United States in violation of law. Subsection A.3 addresses felony violations. Cardi's hand, reaching for his radio, froze. The 2019 amendment, which I personally drafted and submitted to the Senate Judiciary Committee, clarifies that believed to be requires articulable individualized suspicion, not statistical profiling or algorithmic assessment. She paused, watching their faces. "You've cited neither." Fernandez's smirk had evaporated. "Furthermore," Kimberly continued, pulling her phone out fully now, recording openly, "your own enforcement manual, revision 2020-03, page 47, section 4A, explicitly prohibits stops based solely on algorithmic flags without corroborating evidence. Is Section 4C requires verbal articulation of specific observable factors. Section 7B mandates supervisory approval for stops of individuals presenting federal credentials. She let the silence hang. I wrote that manual. I wrote those sections. I submitted the legal framework to Congress. My name is on the authorship page. Cardi's face had gone white. Fernandez looked at his partner, then back at Kimberly, confusion bleeding into something that looked like panic. "Now," Kimberly said quietly, "would you like to run my credentials properly?" Kimberly made the call without asking permission, speed dialing the Pentagon security desk while both agents watched helplessly. "This is Senior Counsel Morgan, badge SC4729. I'm being detained by ICE agents at Pentagon City Metro Plaza. Or I need a security detail and legal counsel immediately." The response was immediate. "Detail dispatched, ma'am. ETA 6 minutes. She lowered the phone, meeting Cardi's eyes. "You might want to run my credentials now, properly this time." Cardi's hands fumbled with his tablet. The crowd had grown larger, phones recording everything. Fernandez stood rigid, the certainty draining from his posture with each passing second. At 6 minutes exactly, 2 black SUVs rolled into the plaza, emergency lights cutting through the dusk. Pentagon security emerged first, 4 officers in tactical gear surrounding Morgan with professional efficiency. 30 seconds later, a Justice Department attorney stepped out, briefcase in hand, her DOJ credentials already extended. "Agent Cardi?" The attorney's voice carried authority. "I'm Margaret Whitfield, our DOJ Civil Rights Division. You're going to step back from Miss Morgan immediately." Cardi's tablet finally loaded. The database return filled his screen in bureaucratic detail. Morgan, Kimberly Ann. Senior Immigration Counsel, Pentagon Office of General Counsel, former DOJ, Office of Immigration Litigation, 2009 to 2018. Primary author, ICE Enforcement Directive, 2020-03, Security Clearance, Top Secret, /SC, Congressional Testimony, 14 appearances, published legal scholarship, 23 articles. His face went from white to gray. Morgan stepped forward, now flanked by Pentagon security and federal attorneys, and asked with surgical precision, "Officers, are you familiar with the legal standards for immigration enforcement stops outlined in Directive 2020-03? Silence. "Because I wrote it," she continued, her voice carrying across the plaza. "And you've violated Sections 4A, 4C, and 7B. Your body cameras have recorded everything." Fernandez actually took a step backward. "I believe," Kimberly said softly, "we'll be continuing this conversation in federal court." The body camera footage became evidence within hours. Federal preservation orders locked down every file, every database query, every algorithmic log entry from that Tuesday evening. Nothing could be deleted, modified, or lost in bureaucratic shuffling. Vincent Shaw took the case personally. A prominent civil rights litigator who'd spent 30 years dismantling discriminatory systems, he saw Kimberly's case as the perfect storm. Irrefutable evidence, sympathetic plaintiff, defendants who documented their own constitutional violations. The federal lawsuit landed like a bomb. Fourth Amendment violations, racial profiling under the Equal Protection Clause, violations of immigration enforcement protocols, deliberate indifference to constitutional rights. Shaw didn't just want damages, he wanted systemic reform, and Kimberly's credentials gave him the ammunition. Discovery was devastating. The algorithmic system's internal logs revealed the truth in cold data. Morgan had been flagged because her commute pattern and physical profile matched statistical patterns of undocumented service workers in the hospitality industry. Translation: she left work late, and she was black. Internal emails were worse. Data analysts had warned supervisors months earlier that the algorithm disproportionately flagged black and brown professionals, doctors leaving hospitals after night shifts, attorneys working late, professors with evening classes. The response? Acceptable margin of error for operational efficiency. Then Shaw's team found the smoking gun buried in DHS archives. Kimberly's own November 2021 memo, 17 pages warning precisely about algorithmic discrimination, constitutional vulnerabilities, due process violations. Her recommendations were explicit, her legal analysis unimpeachable. The file notation was damning. Reviewed but not implemented due to resource constraints. They'd had the warning. They'd had the solution. They'd had the legal framework written by one of the nation's foremost immigration law experts, and they'd filed it away because implementing safeguards was inconvenient. Now that same expert was the plaintiff, and her memo was Exhibit A in a federal civil rights lawsuit that would cost them everything. As Shaw smiled when he added it to the evidence file. Sometimes justice wrote its own closing arguments. The federal trial lasted 5 weeks and made legal history before the verdict even came in. Kimberly Morgan testified for 3 days, serving as both plaintiff and expert witness, a rare dual role that turned the courtroom into a masterclass on immigration law. She walked the jury through her career: Georgetown Law, DOJ, immigration litigation, Pentagon counsel. She presented her published scholarship, her congressional testimony, her legal frameworks that governed ICE operations nationwide. Then Shaw played the body camera footage, 12 minutes of humiliation in high definition. Cardi dismissing her Pentagon credentials, Fernandez smirk when she identified herself, her voice steady despite everything, quoting the laws she'd written, while agents who should have known them violated every standard. I wrote the law, her voice echoed in the silent courtroom. The defense crumbled during cross-examination. Expert witnesses confirmed what the data showed. The algorithmic system used race as a proxy, flagging black and brown professionals at rates that defied any innocent explanation. A former ICE data analyst testified that supervisors ignored bias warnings because the algorithm was meeting quota targets. Shaw introduced internal training materials that made the jury audibly gasp, and agents were explicitly instructed to prioritize operational efficiency and quota achievement over procedural precision. Constitutional safeguards were described as obstacles to productivity. Kimberly's 2021 memo, the one marked "reviewed but not implemented," became the trial's centerpiece. The jury saw a federal agency ignore warnings from its own expert, then detain that same expert using the discriminatory practices she'd specifically condemned. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. The verdict: $8.9 million. Compensatory damages for civil rights violations, punitive damages for deliberate indifference. Agents Cardi and Fernandez were terminated immediately, barred permanently from federal law enforcement. 3 ICE supervisors received formal disciplinary actions. So the algorithmic system was suspended pending comprehensive civil rights review. As the judge read the verdict, Kimberly sat perfectly still, vindicated but not triumphant. Justice felt less like victory and more like finally being believed. Sometimes that's all expertise ever wanted. Kimberly Morgan didn't keep the money. Within 6 months of the settlement, she established the Immigration Rights Defense Initiative, a non-profit providing free legal representation to immigrants wrongfully targeted by enforcement actions. The $8.9 million became seed funding for something larger than personal vindication, a systematic challenge to algorithmic discrimination in immigration enforcement. The court-ordered reforms reshaped ICE from the inside. Mandatory training on racial profiling, algorithmic bias, and immigration law, all using curriculum Morgan developed. Every agent now learned the constitutional standards she'd written, taught by the woman whose detention had exposed their violations. Congress called her back, but this time she wasn't invisible testimony buried in committee records. She sat before the Senate Judiciary Committee as the named plaintiff in a landmark civil rights case, her expertise finally inseparable from her identity. Cameras broadcast her words nationwide as she methodically dismantled algorithmic discrimination in federal law enforcement. Technology doesn't eliminate bias, she testified. It scales it, speeds it up, and gives it the false legitimacy of objectivity. Morgan versus Department of Homeland Security became required reading. Immigration law courses dissected the case, as civil rights clinics used it to challenge discriminatory algorithms across federal agencies. Tech ethics programs studied it as cautionary precedent. Her name, once buried in 8-point font on page 62, now appeared in bold in case law indexes. But the real legacy lived in smaller moments. Attorneys citing her precedent in detention hearings, immigrants released because algorithms couldn't override constitutional rights anymore. Her uncle calling from Philadelphia to say he finally understood why she'd spent her career in the shadows. "You built the foundation first," he said. "Now everyone can see the building." Kimberly Morgan had spent 20 years as an invisible architect. 12 minutes of humiliation in Pentagon City Plaza had made her visible. Sometimes justice required being seen, not just heard. And now, finally, and she was both.